I was just reflecting that the Mayor has very eloquently outlined how the Auckland Plan is an integrated platform for our future. And he's also touched on how it's an opportunity to redefine our city. What I'm really going to talk about today is just what is the influence of the Auckland Spatial Plan on infrastructure, what's actually in the Auckland Plan and therefore what it means for infrastructure, and more particularly about how do we together deliver that infrastructure. And in that regard, I think we have to just reflect back on a little bit of context here, because spatial planning was brought about through the local government reform, and it was the Local Government Auckland Council Act of 2009 that required Auckland Council to undertake spatial planning, and that is best practice. When we think about spatial planning, the Mayor has touched on very much about joining up the dots and bringing parties together. And I like to think about it as making sure that we all concentrate our efforts in the same place at the same time to achieve results. And in Auckland, we haven't necessarily done that in the past. And that's one of the primary purposes of spatial planning. And in that regard, it does promote a balanced development across the region. In that sense, while the Auckland Council Act talked about having a 30-year strategy for development and growth, it was also to meet social, economic, environmental and cultural objectives. And so it is about undertaking objectives such as reducing regional disparity and thinking about where that investment actually goes. And you'll see a reflection later of how the Council has started to prioritise based on those multiple objectives. And so if we just think about the Auckland Plan and its influence on future infrastructure, we can see that really what it's about in terms of infrastructure is optimising the value, to be thinking about resilience. I just noted the question about Christchurch. And more particularly, to be efficient and effective in the way in which we deliver. And in that respect, it is about avoiding the duplication of the respective decision makers who all influence what we do in a geographical sense, whether it's central government, local government, or whether it's the private or third-party housing sector or whomever might be involved in infrastructure in what manner or form. It's also about marrying strategy with delivery, and I think you've heard the Mayor talk about it before, that often we think about the plan, but then we don't have a plan of action to make sure that we deliver on the ground. And there's very much a concerted effort now in Auckland to do just that and to do it in very much a unified way. So that's the context. And I appreciate that you may not be able to read all of these details of the slide, but I'm just going to take you through it because there is a vision, and the Mayor articulates that vision very well in terms of Auckland being the world's most livable city. That vision has been picked up in the Auckland Plan. And there are also outcomes in the Auckland Plan, and it's very easy for us just to gloss over those outcomes. But I didn't really want to do that because every single one of those outcomes is underpinned by infrastructure of some formal nature. So when we think about the outcome of a fair and a healthy Auckland and a safe Auckland, we do think about central government's investment, for example, in healthcare institutions and in our hospitals. Or if we think about a safe environment, whether it's through prevention programs or whether it's through more corrections in institutions. When we think about a green Auckland, we can think about our park network, or we can think about the innovations that we have to make sure that we are a more sustainable environment. We can think about that we share the targets with central government in terms of electricity generation coming from renewable resources. When we think about Auckland being one of prosperity and opportunity, we have to have a city that functions, and infrastructure is absolutely critical to that. We're thinking about a well-connected Auckland and an accessible Auckland. Transport obviously is at the top of the billing there, but so is broadband. And there is currently, a program of central government to roll ultra-fast broadband out across Auckland, including rural Auckland, and Auckland Council has its own investment about getting Wi-Fi, for example, in its cultural institutions such as libraries. And we can think about a beautiful Auckland that's loved by its people. And I like to think of the Pukeko Bridge. So for those of you who know the state highway network that goes effectively to the north to Puhoi, I think it's one of the most beautiful motorways. And a couple of years ago, there was an article in the paper asking people what would be one of their most favourite projects that they would nominate for an award, and I thought to myself, gee, that would be a really good one to nominate, and someone actually beat me to it, not that I was asked. But when we think about infrastructure lasts for a long time, and that infrastructure to the north not only helps to serve in terms of functioning of movement of people, but it's also about the experience we have on the journey. And when we think about the multiple objectives such as fostering tourism, then that becomes a really important part of meeting multiple objectives. And it's also about not just thinking around short-term economic development, but long-term gains. And we do know that in terms of Australian research from the past, that attractiveness does attract investment. And so when we start thinking about cost-benefit ratios, it's important in my view to think not only the short-term, but the long-term. And Chris, I noticed your comment earlier about the social cost. So that's a factor that figures into those. Then we've got a culturally rich and creative Auckland, and we often talk about the artists in our society and what they contribute, but we also have to think about the major investment in our institutions. Auckland is small on a worldwide scale. We're not a global city at all. And when we think about the governance reform, we were all in our respective previous local authorities trying to invest in cultural institutions for the respective 7 city or district councils. We cannot afford it. We do not have enough people to do that. So Auckland really has the opportunity now to invest well and to invest once in those cultural institutions that serve all of Auckland, to think about outreach programs, and then to think about culture and other institutions that serve more local communities. So there will be one international city centre with a heart, and that's where the Auckland Plan talks about investment of international quality in those cultural institutions, such as our recently upgraded art gallery. And then last, we have a Māori identity, and that is a differentiating and defining point for us in the world. We all know that, and we all celebrate it with wonderful events like the Rugby World Cup, and we showcase ourselves in that regard. Well, there's a lot of Māori infrastructure, such as marae developments, that also contribute to those well-beings, and that is in the plan, and it features very strongly. The Mayor didn't touch on the transformational shifts, but in light of time, I'm not going to go through in detail, but I just wanted to show how infrastructure is a cross-cutting theme that underpins everything that's in the Auckland Plan. And it would be very easy to read the Auckland Plan and to only go and read the infrastructure chapter. And I'm just really imploring that you don't do that. The Auckland Plan needs to be read as a whole. And I say that quite deliberately because there are principles by which decision making is made. I think there has been some criticism that the Auckland Plan does not necessarily identify clearly enough about how trade-offs are made. There was a lot of criticism about whether or not it was evidence-based enough. It certainly was evidence-based enough, but we were bold as well to say that there has been a lot of evidence around and we don't need to repeat ourselves endlessly. And we also took an approach that decision-making does take account of evidence, because otherwise you might get the wrong policy outcome, but it also is value-based. And the Mayor came to this council with values, and it was a value such as being prudent and also about being bold and fair. And they are principles that help determine decision-making. These now are in the Auckland Plan, such as being sustainable and valuing te ao Māori and being affordable, and also checking and adapting our progress. And just thinking of one of the questions earlier, about what might happen, we can't see the future. No, we can't, and it's very uncertain and change is very rapid. But there is a process in the Auckland Plan to monitor and review and to update on a 6-yearly basis, as well as to report annually, and that's quite significant, because one of the things that we do fail at often is to monitor our progress to see whether we're achieving targets, but more particularly as well, are we achieving the actual outcomes on the ground that we said we would. So all this is here is all of the strategic directions. There's one for every chapter. I also wanted to touch on the importance of interregional links, and I think we've really beefed up in the final Auckland Plan the critical nature of the fact that Auckland does not sit alone. The Mayor mentioned earlier that the UNISA agreement, the Upper North Island Strategic Alliance, has been signed, and I should acknowledge the role of Waikato here in terms of approaching Auckland and then Auckland approaching Northland to make sure that we acknowledge that everything we do has a bearing on each other, whether it's land use, whether it's infrastructure. Most recently, the UNISA chief executives and political arm approved to do a port study together, because that is incredibly interrelated of how we operate. So not just thinking about Auckland that's small, but thinking actually, within New Zealand we are small, and we really do have to think about how we can be more competitive internationally in the way in which we move freight, for example. Now this here is what I call a simple story, and it's called the Auckland diagram, and we pinched the idea off London because they had a really simple diagram, and we wanted anyone to really be able to draw, if they had to, what's in the Auckland Plan. The geography of Auckland is very, very complex, and so we wanted to simplify it. And what this really does is two things. It says that the blue-green environment is critical, and as the Mayor rightly pointed out, the way we provide for wastewater and stormwater will either protect or otherwise that wonderful environment, which is our comparative advantage. Worldwide, there are very few cities in the world that have an urban heart that gives us access to such a beautiful coastal, marine and rural environment. It also shows, though, that we are going to be a more contained and a compact city for a whole range of reasons. One of those is because per unit household infrastructure cost comes down. Both of our council-controlled organisations, Auckland Transport and Watercare Services Limited, had strongly supported the idea of having a quality compact city for that reason. But this diagram shows us something that is a challenge for infrastructure in Auckland. We are long and thin. If you look at the London diagram, it isn't long and thin. We know that we all have to go through effectively a portal through the centre of Auckland, and that does present enormous challenges for us all. And we have, of course, two major pieces of infrastructure in terms of our airport, and the number and the value of imports and exports that go through that and through the Port of Auckland is tremendous, as are the number of visitors. And so these are both gateways to Auckland, New Zealand and to the world. We also are noting, and just thinking about resilience here, that we do need to expand. We have allowed for growth at the edges, which is what the yellow squares are about, greenfields, but we've also allowed for growth in two satellite centres, Warkworth in the north and Pukekohe in the south, and in some ways that's a degree of resilience because those centres will be big enough, in the order of say 25,000 to 50,000 persons, that they can have a degree of sub-regional autonomy. Now this is the detailed development strategy map. You will not be able to read all of the detail. The key messages are we are protecting our rural environment and preventing or limiting more sporadic rural subdivision for a whole range of reasons, but one is thinking of the future, about the importance of food production and the rural contribution to the economy, and that rural industry co-locates quite deliberately to Auckland because we are the business centre of New Zealand in terms of financial and other institutions of that nature. But it also shows that contained urban environment, which has multiple kind of creamy, salmony colours, indicating that there will be levels of change within the urban area, some more intense than others. The purple dots are the 10 metropolitan centres, and that's where we would see the most growth. There's little white specks, we would see the least growth, and in between there's a range of growth in terms of accommodating intensification. Outside of that, we've also prioritised growth areas, and we've taken account of the nature of the infrastructure in each of those areas in terms of priority. So Newland, for example, it's had huge investment in transport infrastructure already. We need to optimise that investment. So our expectations in the Auckland Plan with respect to infrastructure is to optimise the investment that we've already placed to get the best dollar out of the value and to ensure that we have resilience. We've also built flexibility into the plan, and this was a big change from where we were in the draft Auckland Plan. And I do want to acknowledge Martin Newdale here, who we commissioned for an independent review of our draft Auckland Plan. And we were quite ambitious. We still are ambitious. We are looking at having 70% of our population growth within the urban heart, which is measured by the old metropolitan urban limit, over 30 years. And 30% outside, but we've now built in flexibility, as the Mayor said, for potentially 40% of that growth outside. But we're also saying we're at a really low ebb. The reality is that building consents are low. There has only been a marginal increase. We need a minimum of 10 to 13,000 households based on our population growth now. We are not getting that. We probably had around 2,500 in the last year. We already are short by 10,000 households. When we talk about rapid growth, we are way behind the ball game, and this council is taking a very active approach with respect to housing, which is another form of infrastructure. I notice that the National Infrastructure Plan tends to only refer to social housing, but housing is part of our infrastructure for people. But what this has done in terms of the growth strategy is said that we acknowledge that we need in the first decade, probably 50% of our growth will be in greenfields. We currently have what we call unconstrained development supply for about 2 to 3 years, or three odd years. We're just refining the statistics now. That is too low based on our rate of growth. We are looking at 5 to 7 years, 7 years average. And we're not talking land supply anymore, because the whole point of this plan is to integrate infrastructure. We could zone as much land as you want, and we used to do that, but if the infrastructure's not in the ground, then the capacity can't be taken up. If the zoning's not applied where it's operative, then the capacity can't be taken up. So that is a new concept, and I'm quite aware of places around Auckland that are zoned and don't have infrastructure capacity at hand. We need to make sure that is at hand. That's why we've got these new goals, and that's why in the first decade 50% is in greenfield and 50% in brownfields, because of the quantum of growth that we have in Auckland and the need to get that happening fast. These are maps, and I won't go into the detail of them, but it just shows you the level of refinement that the staff are undertaking in terms of which areas have capacity or which don't. And so the darker green here, those are where we already have unrestrained capacity, i.e. ready to go. And as I said, there's probably in the order of around 3 years of that. It is in the north and the south. So land supply and constrained development capacity is not the only thing that's limiting housing construction at the moment. It's one significant factor, but it's not the only factor. We've also got targets in the Auckland Plan just about where that population growth might go. Now, this is really important for all infrastructure providers in terms of where they might put that investment, particularly noting, of course, where the sequencing of both central government and council's investment is as well, joining up the dots. The Auckland Plan includes a table of what is the critical infrastructure, and it's defined really in 2 ways. So thinking of the fundamental, the water, the wastewater, the transport, the communications, those are all very critical. You know, if they go down in a day, it affects business, it affects well-being and you know, life. Other critical infrastructure, though, are our social and community infrastructure, and in the long term, in terms of a livable city, we need both. What this table also does, and I know you can't read it on the screen necessarily, it also says who's the lead player, because council isn't the lead player in everything. There's many parties, as I said earlier, that make decisions about helping to build Auckland and to grow Auckland and effectively New Zealand. So, moving on to implementation, the Auckland Plan sits here setting the direction, and it is driving everything. As an organisation in Auckland Council now, everything we do is to align to the Auckland Plan. This is now about a plan of action of doing. The direction is set, so are the priorities. 2 key instruments for council are the Unitary Plan, and the other one is the long-term plan, our 10-year budget, what's affordable in the first 10 years. The Mayor has touched on that. We have a whole range of other strategies, as you will appreciate, such as the economic development strategy. However, we're also trying to reduce the number of plans and strategies. Quite frankly, we don't believe we need a transport strategy. We've got one. It's in the Auckland Plan. It's about having one integrated transport network. We're not saying we only need public transport. We're saying we need to optimise the investment in the existing motorway network. We need to complete that network, as the Mayor pointed out. Finishing that network in terms of Amity and the east-west link is very important for freight. We are investing in everything to optimise the future, and we're also noting that you can't always just build your way out of congestion, and that's what our transport modelling sees as well. So I just want to touch briefly on the Unitary Plan because it's so significant as a regulatory tool. I'd like to acknowledge that New Zealand Productivity Commission is recommending that there be some regulatory reform. There have been recent announcements of some of that regulatory reform, but our Unitary Plan will be ready for public notification in September 2013. We are proposing to have very upfront engagement on that early on in a concentrated way. There's already a multi-sector external reference group and consultation and engagement being undertaken, but our submission to central government is that that process needs to be simplified. Our proposal is if we do that consultation and engagement well at the front end, then let's not have appeals through that Unitary Plan process unless it's only on a point of law. Let's not relitigate, because our development sector and telling us that basically it's the end-to-end planning process that is a cost to development and it's stopping Auckland moving forward. It's not just the resource consent process, it's the policy development process as well. It can take anywhere from 7 to 10 years. It's too long if we want to get on and deliver. The long-term plan, I've just identified there that everything is being shaped by the Auckland Plan. The long-term plan makes very big reference to the Auckland Plan. It identifies these areas of priorities, which I showed you on the development strategy to start with. What we're trying to do now is to align the allocation of budget to those priorities. We've done the best we can to turn the ship in the direction of the Auckland Plan. Every time we do the 3-yearly review of the LTP, we should get that better alignment. But what I did want to mention is that we do integrate it now with infrastructure. So we work very closely with Water Care Services Limited. So in terms of those priorities, for example, they could tell us that basically everywhere that we were suggesting could be a priorities from a water and a wastewater point of view, they could service, even if it meant sometimes local upgrades. They could not necessarily do it in Warkworth, so the emphasis in Warkworth in the first 3 years will be very much on planning. So that's just where we're integrating across the board. And when we do think about upgrades such as the Central Interceptor or the City Rail Link, we have to remember it takes a long time. And if we don't start now, both of those projects are effectively 10-year projects. In the meantime, we're doing local upgrades. So it's imperative that we do act with some degree of urgency and don't end up being paralysed by endless analysis. Some of the activities that we're doing, and it's in our implementation plan, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, is that we are using new systems and processes ourselves. So when we were preparing the long-term plan, we really did want to start to say, are we aligning to the Auckland Plan? We had I can't remember how many. I thought it was 32, but I think in the end it was around 78 new investment proposals proposed by our council-controlled organisations. And what we did is we started to identify how would we actually rate each of those investment proposals against each other, and how would we rate them against the Auckland Plan. And we introduced a scoring system, and we put what were the big transformational shifts, which was the city centre and the Southern Initiative. What were the big the 6 transformational shifts that I had on the chart earlier? What were the 2 big initiatives, the City Centre and the Southern Initiative? What were the prioritised growth centres? And then what were the strategic directions in each of the chapters? And we weighted them and gave them different points. And then we went through and we scored all of those investment proposals, and then we did a common sense kind of lens over it. And interestingly enough, those investment proposals fell where we more or less expected them to fall. But my key point is that we have to have systems and processes to make sure that we don't just carry on business as usual and say, oh yes, we've got the Auckland Plan and we just go on and we all do our own thing. We really do have to start to turn the ship to say, are we doing what we're saying that we want to do in the Auckland Plan, and are we putting that level of capital expenditure in those places at the same time, in the right place, focusing, achieving, and then moving on and shifting that investment somewhere else. So this is about sequencing and programming over 3 years, over 5 years, over 10, and then over 30 years, and readjusting as we go through and monitor that progress. Thank you. This just shows you where the bold expenditure is. The Mayor's already touched on that in terms of transport. It's way at the top. But we also have quite a lot in terms of lifestyle and economic development. The Mayor also touched on that. I don't need to canvass with you where that spend is, but we have the top projects that in the Auckland Plan, the top 3 ones, and then Auckland Transport has around $500 million per annum to spend. The Mayor has touched on the major infrastructure projects. I just want to mention, because it's not on any of these slides, that the local boards also have a degree of funding, and they allocate that funding out. They have their local board agreement, and it particularly is significant for community infrastructure. What we have been doing over the last 18 months, and it's not really built so much into this long-term plan, but we certainly hope it will be in the next one, is we're asking all our asset managers to start to categorise the geographical area that that infrastructure sits in. Now, where it's a network, that might be hard. We might have to allocate that out, but where it's a defined project, it's easy. So in the end, because this is about spatial planning, we'll be able to put all of the infrastructure together in geographical areas, and we'll be able to say how much are we really spending in this area, and is that where the focus should be, and is the focus where we said it should be. So there is, for example, in the city centre right now, we know there's more capital expenditure there than the Southern Initiative, and rightly so, because the Southern Initiative is a new initiative. In 3 years' time we might see that changing a bit, because the city centre's already taken off anyway. Now, this is what we're calling the implementation of the Auckland Plan, delivering with others, and this is about having the Auckland Plan addendum, and as part of that, an annual update. The first one is due on the 7th of August. It's not just about what we are doing as Auckland Council, it's about what everyone's doing. So having an implementation plan about how we work together, how do we report and monitor against the Auckland Plan is critical. The Auckland Plan and the addendum will only be updated every 6 years, but that annual update will go into the addendum on an annual basis, and we'll also monitor trend on a 3-yearly basis. So we're working very keenly on all of this at the moment. So that's basically what I've said. The implementation plan, of course, is to maintain the engagement and the goodwill of the multitude of sectors and stakeholders that have helped to write and produce the Auckland Plan with us, so that we are delivering together on target. Most recently, there was an informal officer infrastructure forum, and we want to widen this out, but the whole point of this is to bring parties together. Ultimately, there's likely to be a political forum around infrastructure on a regular basis, together with a technical officer infrastructure forum, so that we are making sure that we do join up the dots, as the Mayor said earlier. And these are all little things that we're putting in place, whether it's systems, processes, whether it's our resources or communication and engagement. That's part of our implementation update. But I really like this quote. We are into transformation here. It is a turning point in our history. It is an opportunity, as the Mayor said, to redefine Auckland for New Zealand and for Aucklanders. But transformative change really occurs in instant revolutions. It's a change that actually evolves in many small ways, and there's many small things as well as some big things that have been occurring over the last few years that really have set us on a new path and direction.